This video is going to cover chapters 6 and 7 of Smith for the discussion boards this week, and then there will be a second video for chapters 8 and 9. So I'm going to go through this Prezi really briefly, and I'll focus on the parts that are a little bit more important. So this Prezi has a series of guided questions. Make sure you read through those because they'll help guide your reading. The important thing to remember in this era is as Rome decays, and we have a lot historically going on in this time period, especially with civil unrest, with governments falling, and with a lot of plague and disease. As Rome decays, the church starts to take over, but it makes a lot of sense for this to happen because society is in such unrest and people don't have answers for a lot of things that are going on. They turn to an ultimate leader instead. So we turn away from democracy back to more of an oligarchy approach, which means rhetoric is used, but rhetorical theory is not heavily developed in this time period. The focus is less on creating new ways of understanding thinking, and it's more on communicating the right thinking to the people that already exist. So we're going to focus more on Christianity. So this is the patristic era of rhetoric as Smith describes, and what we have in this particular era is hermeneutics, which are analysis or interpretations, become biblical hermeneutics. So it's the correct interpretation of the Bible. Those lucky enough and privileged enough and knowledgeable enough to go to a seminary school learn biblical hermeneutics. They learn the right way to interpret the passages. So what we see here is a shift. We're still using some of Aristotle's theories, but we shift logos from being logic to the Word of God. This is really important because it changes what truth can mean and what truth actually does mean. So we can see how Plato becomes an influence on a lot of our early especially our early prominent priests. You guys can read through all of these notes. What I want to really focus on with all of them is there's a huge difference between rhetoric and truth, and this all the way through modernism. So another couple hundred years, we have a huge just gaping hole between rhetoric and the purpose and the function of rhetoric and what rhetoric does and truth and where truth can lie. So this period starts that split between the two, and eventually when the modernists in science and the renaissance of rhetoric come and pick it back up, what we see very heavily is that truth lies under logic, and logic and rhetoric are very, very separate subdisciplines. We do not think logically when we use rhetoric, and we don't use rhetoric to influence people to think logically, and a lot of this stems from this removal of truth from rhetoric. So rhetoric becomes delivery. We're picking up on Cicero's delivery and we're saying, okay, this is what rhetoric does. It's this particular action, how I communicate, the words I use to communicate, how information gets across, but truth comes from logic, and logic is just one way of thinking, and logic is always right. We can see later on how that's obviously easily overturned with the if I make a box and I put all statements in this box are false, and so now I'm in this really, really ugly loophole. We can see how problematic logic is, especially in combination with truth, but at the time period it made more sense to separate rhetoric into delivery and style, and logic into a method of thinking, into the epistemic aspect, and that's where truth lies, not in rhetoric. So we're siding very heavily with Plato. So all of this social unrest leads to the need to converge culture. We're all trying to get along. And so what we start to see is all of these influences come, and that's where Augustine is taught. So how do these particular ideas influence Augustine? And then we can see the Platonic influence as well. So where is truth? How do we understand truth? So for Augustine, what I really want you guys to notice is his conversion story, and it's on page 156 of the text. All of the choices that he makes for his conversion story are really, really, really important because they have a lot of Christian mythology tied to them. So he's showing that he understands what it means to be a Christian. He's demonstrating through tears, through the innocence of youth, how you can be saved, you can be converted, and how innocent youth don't necessarily need to be converted. They're already truthful, they're already innocent. They just need to be taught specific kinds of information. They need to be taught the scriptures. All of these aspects of his conversion story, the fact that it happened under a tree, whether it happened that way in real life or not, that story, myth and narrative, has a lot of significant power for rhetoric as style and delivery. I'm using myth and narrative to convert more people through my own conversion story. I'm using myth and narrative through my rhetoric of delivery to inform learn people what they're supposed to know, the symbols that they're supposed to recognize, the innocence of youth, the pamphlet, the way that the little boy talks, the fact that he was crying sad tears underneath a tree, Garden of Eden. All of these become really, really important to his conversion story, and so they demonstrate his approach to rhetoric, but they also limit rhetoric to style and delivery. What we're seeing is that he's redesigning Cicero, so how do we focus on these kinds of style, and then what's the purpose? For Cicero, it was to be a civic man. For Augustine, it's a leader in the church. And then we can see the biblical hermeneutics coming out of it. This goes on to develop a very specific approach to linguistics, or semiotics, sorry, not linguistics. So how does the idea come to me? How do I understand the idea? How do I transmit the idea? How do you all receive it? And then how do you make sense of it in a series of signs? This becomes logic and a way of thinking where rhetoric is then just style and delivery. So how do I improve my style so that the receiver capturing the sign and decoding the sign is much more effective? So like I said in the other video, how do I communicate cat, or how do I communicate pet, so that you get black cat? That is the whole goal of this particular approach. What we can see is we can divide the kinds of signs and the kinds of figurative language that we're using here. What's really important that's coming out of all of this is the separation into 4 distinct groups. We see this very similar separation in everything that we read about audiences from the Islamic point of view and from Eastern culture as well. So we have those with faith who don't need parables to understand the message. We have those that are educated but not converted. We have the masses, and I mean like literally the dumb masses, and then we have children. These 4 separations continue to hold weight until basically the civil rights movement in the 1960s. We changed the categories for each of these 4 audiences, but for the most part, we continue to see audiences as 4 distinct classes with an uneducated, dumb mass public that needs to be converted in a very specific way, and with children still as innocent. So these influences are really, really important for how we understand who we communicate to and how we communicate to them. These come back over and over again, and they're really, really important, so you really, really, really need to focus on them in case you haven't gotten that so far, from modernism. So how do we understand who can understand truth and who can find truth through modernism? It's a breakdown of these 4 audiences. Again, not exactly the same category names, but essentially these same things. When we see, especially in the abolitionist movement and in this women's rights movement, both the African Americans fighting for freedom and the African Americans that were free fighting for freedom for everybody, as well as women, they were fighting these 4 categories where women were lumped into the third one. Women are smaller, our brains are physically smaller, so we must automatically be dumber. African Americans, because their skin color is different, they're lumped into that particular category, they must be dumber. So these categories shift slightly, but for the most part, these are the 4 categories of audiences, how we change style and delivery all the way through modernism. So keep those in mind. Moving on from Augustine, we move into the medieval period. Again, we're still focused on rhetoric as style and delivery, but we're starting to bring back logic. So this particular movement is going to start to influence what we see come next with the existentialists and the modernists. We're bringing science back into it. We're about to hit the renaissance of rhetoric where we're like, yes, art is good again. We can think again. Here are all the things we need to do. So right before that happens, what we start to do is we separate officially at this point in scholarship rhetoric from logic. So logic is a way of thinking, rhetoric is a way of delivering thought. Style and delivery, logic. Very, very important split. Okay, so what you'll notice with these scholars that Smith covers is he's really pointing out and he's really showing the distinction and the categorical separation of rhetoric from logic that happens as we move through this particular time period in these scholars. So we're seeing a split, a full-on divide between rhetoric and logic, where rhetoric is just style and delivery, and that's really important. Smith moves very briefly into Islamic rhetoric. That's also covered in the additional reading, so I'm not going to go over that very much here. But as you can see, Averroes, as we talk about in the Averroes piece that we read, also separates audiences into categories of how they can be spoken to and how they can be categorized. Finally, we have a few final theorists that Smith discusses, and what we're starting to see is science and thought and education, and a focus on science, thought, and education coming back into the scholarship. And so we're building up the category of logic, and we're starting to define and defend and discuss what is it that happens when we think logically? What is it that happens when we think? What does it even mean to think? And so then what happens when we have these two distinct categories? Finally, Smith talks about letter writing and public speaking. The really important part here is that we write arguments, obviously, composition, but at this time period, writing was not as common. And as we start to talk about how we write and approaches to writing, we can see, especially in like Aristotelian and Rhetorica ad Herennium approaches to delivery and approaches to rhetoric coming back in our writing. We're not calling it rhetoric yet, but we can see the rhetorical model being revisited in, at that time period, or contemporary to this time period, modern scholarship. Okay, so that covers chapter 6. What you'll obviously notice here, rhetoric is not epistemic. We have an audience segregation. The church equates logos with the truth, which makes logic the truth, and logic becomes the word of God. That's really important. And the church has very centralized power as opposed to people power, so the development of rhetorical theory is very minor in comparison to a lot of other time periods, but using rhetoric during sermons and to make sermons more engaging was a common practice at the time period. Okay, and now we'll switch to chapter 7. So now we'll cover chapter 7. So the Renaissance of rhetoric, Renaissance means an enlightenment, an awakening. So we're starting to think about thinking again. So series of guided questions, make sure you read through these. The big thing that we want to realize with history is that we have people who have money and who have power who are now funding artists, and they want them to create. Because they're creating, for the most part, they're creating very religious pieces. And what we find is once we start creating a significant amount of artwork, we need to preserve some of it. We need to keep a lot of these things around so that we know what to do with it. So we're starting to, in the preservation of a lot of this thought, revisit the ancient Greeks and bring some of their ideas back in relation to the church. So we're contextualizing for the modern or the contemporary understanding of what it is it means in our life, and in this case it's the church. We're bringing a lot of that Greek rhetoric back, but we're reading it and we're understanding it and we're interpreting it in line with the church. So we're using biblical hermeneutics essentially to reread Greek and Roman texts to figure out how do we convert more people, how do we make civilization more successful now. Like I say in the other video, the printing press is revolutionary because it's going to change who has access to reading and writing, and for the most part, this changes the priest's approach to sermonizing because they're going to start sermonizing in the vernacular. So whatever the language is for that particular period or for that particular town or that particular settlement, that's the language they're going to use instead of Latin. They want the people to understand the message and they want people to understand everything they're saying, and that's a huge shift. We also have a distinction between humanists and scholastics, really, really important, but not very important for this class. So we're going to breeze through that part. What we're seeing with Dante and Petrarch, especially with this humanist focus on speaking in the vernacular, is that this starts to redevelop rhetorical theory. So we're moving away from the separation between rhetoric and logic, and we're trying to bring those two categories closer together. But as you can see here, when we start to discuss the vernacular and sermonizing in the vernacular, that is a focus on style and delivery, but at least we're theorizing how to get messages across, how to interpret biblical passages so that they make sense to the people in front of us, what language to use to do that. So God is still logic, and logic is still separate because logic is still truth, but theorists and priests care again about how we deliver this message, how the church becomes meaningful to the lives of everyday people. We see Trebizond and Savonarola also dealing with the church. What is the distinction between church and government? So we have a lot of theories, a lot of the government relationships that we were dealing with in Greek times we're seeing unfold again here. The next theorist that we have is Machiavelli. So what we're dealing with, especially with Machiavelli, is the idea that our own personal history can influence how we develop rhetorical theory, and this is something that we really haven't thought about or we haven't noticed as heavily as we do with Machiavelli. So Machiavelli attempted to start a revolution. He did start a minor revolution, and he was the leader of it. And quickly after gaining power and attempting to make life better for the people that were following him, they turned on him and they ousted him. And so his opinion of humans and human nature completely changed. And so we can see how that's influencing, and to a huge extent, adding a pessimistic ideal underlying his approaches to rhetorical theory, because he doesn't think that people are inherently good. He has a pessimistic idea of that instead. So what Machiavelli is focusing on is when we deliver a rhetorical speech, when we are the person in power, how do we maintain power? At the same time, how do we make sure that our people are happy so that they don't overthrow us? He's one of the first theorists to read the ancient Greek and Roman texts and care about audience reception. So if we have these ideas and we have these ideals, how do we maintain them? How do we share them? How do we get our people to buy into them? How do we get our people to understand them? And what happens if, and so we're talking virtues and vices here, what happens if our opponent turns one of our virtues into a vice? How do we turn one of their vices into a virtue? So where Aristotle and Cicero cared about how do we theorize these things, Machiavelli said, how do we theorize these and how do we practice them? So he's bringing Aspasia's praxis, where we want to create a combination of theory and practice. How do we make this happen? And that's a huge development for rhetorical theory. So he talks about building credibility, corrupting of the virtues and the vices, and you can see Smith has some great tables and great comparisons. But essentially what we're doing is we're talking about, if I deliver a speech today or I try to build credibility through these videos, what do you guys see as credible? What do I think? And then I use, as far as delivery goes, to be effective, to be an effective speaker in front of you. And then how do I expect you to understand that so that you'll watch all of these videos? What do I need to add to these videos? What kinds of discussion so that you'll watch all of them? What do I think that's doing? That's what Machiavelli cared about, is how do I put this together? How do I think it's going to work for my audience? And how do I keep my audience invested in that particular message? What is it that I need to do? The next two theorists that are covered, Agricola and Melanchthon. So we're specifically dealing with the idea of rereading Greek and Roman rhetoric in light of modern times. So how do we contextualize, given all of our hermeneutics, given that most of these theorists were priests, they were educated by the church, how do we reread the Greek and Roman texts and make them important again? So we're dealing specifically with different types of rhetorics. So we're breaking down categories, what belongs into sermonizing, speech and delivery, what belongs when priests are speaking to each other, what if there are legal issues involved, how do we separate these different kinds of formats, and how can rhetoric as style and delivery help us do that? Okay, so as we move forward, what we start to see is the split between rhetoric and logic is getting much closer, and what Rasmus ends up doing is putting rhetoric as a subcategory of logic. So logic becomes the dominant way of thinking, and then rhetoric and rhetorical theory and style and delivery became a type of logical thinking, an approach to this large category of logic. So there are tropes and figures that belong to certain kinds of logic, and that's what we all need to understand. So he basically switched what the Greeks and the Romans called rhetoric, he is now calling logic. This is a really, really, again, important switch. When science starts to dominate and the church starts to lose power, the scientists pick up on that, and so then rhetoric stays as a subcategory for a really, really long period of time. Next, we have Martin Luther. I think the other video talks about him extensively, so I'm not going to cover him very much here. We have history in England and Spain with a lot of conflicts, a lot of changes to the relationship between church and government that all influence how we talk about style and delivery and the importance of style and delivery. You tell them that the religion they've been practicing their entire life, the belief system that they hold, is invalid, you're going to have a problem. So how do we understand rhetoric, and how do we rhetorically convince all of these people of these ideas and of these specific changes? And the big one to England is the shift towards a parliamentary or a participatory government. They do have a parliament, which means the people get to participate. Yes, it was still rich white landowning men, but it was people and not just the king, which changes the power dynamic, and it changes the relationship between the people and the government and what it is the masses need to know. And so this shifts back to, we need to educate. We need to focus on all of these ideas. So the big takeaways from this particular section is that rhetoric is still not epistemic. It doesn't make knowledge. Logic makes knowledge. Rhetoric communicates knowledge. There's no invention. There's only delivery. And as the church starts to lose power, rhetoric, logic, and dialectic gain power. If you have any questions about either of these two chapters, feel free to post them in the discussion board with the questions in the quest that you engage in or the Twitter essays, or just post them to Twitter and I will answer them there.